Hey guys, tonight we begin with someone important to history. The medieval peasant, the unsung hero of Europe, the backbone of the economy, the human lab rat who tested every food, plague, and famine nature threw at them, mostly without surviving it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. If you truly want to eat like a medieval peasant, you must start your day the way they did, by waking up and immediately regretting it. Dawn arrives with a rooster that screams like it's being murdered, a sound designed to remind you that joy is a sin and sleep is a luxury you'll never afford. You rise from your straw mattress, which has all the comfort of a sack filled with broken twigs and whatever insects moved in overnight. Now breakfast. You approach the hearth where the cottage lives. And I do mean lives. This thing has been simmering longer than you've been alive. It's a family heirloom in the worst way. Every morning, water is added to thin the prehistoric sludge at the bottom. Ingredients. Whatever the household didn't starve to death eating yesterday, grains, beans, roots, and the occasional mystery chunk that might be vegetable or might not. The pot is never fully cleaned. Medieval peasants didn't wash dishes. They just kept boiling until the bacteria either died or achieved sainthood. The flavor profile is complex. Imagine if depression had a taste. Imagine warm mud, but angrier. Imagine chewing something and thinking, this definitely has a history. If you're lucky, someone throws in a carrot. Not for nutrition, just for morale. A bright orange speck of hope in a sea of beige despair. Then you've got bread, a medieval delicacy made of reef flour, water, and pure contempt. Dense, dark, and capable of breaking not just teeth, but generational morale. Milling was so inefficient that bits of stone regularly ended up baked into the loaf. Congratulations, your breakfast now doubles as dental Russian roulette. You might imagine medieval life as a world of knights in shining armor, kings at grand feasts, and tables heavy with roasted meats and spiced wine. But if you were alive in the Middle Ages, as most people were asterisk, you would not have been anywhere near the warmth of castle halls or banquet tables. You would have been a peasant, bound to the land, and your greatest daily struggle would not have been dragons or war, but simply finding enough food to make it through the day. For the medieval peasant, hunger was not an occasional discomfort. It was a constant companion, a familiar ache in the stomach that traveled through every season, shaping every decision from sunrise to nightfall. When we talk about medieval food, we are not speaking about delicacies, exotic spices, or royal banquets. We are speaking about survival. And survival, for most people, meant bread. Bread was the center of nearly every meal. It was not soft or fluffy like the bread you might pick up at a modern bakery, and it certainly was not sweet or enriched with butter. Instead, medieval bread was often dark, heavy, coarse, and made from whatever grain was cheapest or most readily available. Wheat was expensive and reserved mostly for wealthier classes. The poor relied primarily on barley, rye, oats, and sometimes peas and beans ground into flour, forming a dense loaf known as maslin bread. The process of making bread began long before dawn. If you were a peasant woman, and it was usually women who managed household food, you would rise in near darkness, when the air still held a sharp chill. You would begin by grinding grain, sometimes using a hand quern, a small rotating stone mill. The sound was rhythmic and heavy, a dull scraping that echoed through the wooden walls of the cottage. It could take hours to produce enough flour for a single day's bread. The grinding stones were often rough, and tiny fragments of stone dust found their way into the flour. When baked, those particles hardened within the bread, gradually wearing down teeth. In fact, dental wear is one of the most common skeletal markers used today to identify medieval remains. People literally ground their teeth away just by eating. Once the flour was ready, it was mixed with water, a little salt if available, and sometimes a sour, yeasted mixture saved from previous loaves. Kneading was a slow, tiring process, done by hand on wooden boards or stone surfaces. There was no warm kitchen, no polished ovens. Instead, peasants used a communal village oven, large stone or clay structures shared by dozens of families. The oven might be fired only once or twice a week, so bread had to last several days, growing harder with time. You might picture walking with your dough through the village, wrapped in cloth or resting in a wooden bowl, waiting in line for a turn at the oven. The baker would charge a fee, sometimes a coin, but more often a portion of the dough itself. Nothing was free, not even heat. When the bread emerged, it was dense enough that cutting it required strength. Sometimes the loaves were baked so hard they could last weeks, even months, becoming tools or bowls before they returned to food. A hollowed-out loaf might be used as a trencher, a thick piece of stale bread that served as a plate. Gravy and stew would soak into it, softening the bottom, and at the end of the meal the trencher would be eaten, or given to the poor, or even fed to animals. Bread was rarely eaten alone. If you were fortunate, you might flavor it with pottage, a thick soup made from whatever vegetables could be grown or scavenged: cabbage, leeks, onions, turnips, carrots, peas. Pottage simmered slowly over a fire, growing thicker day after day. Each night leftovers were kept and added to the pot, so that by the end of the week, the taste might be deep and sour, almost fermented. Meat was rare. Most peasants went weeks or even months without tasting any. When available, it often came from old or sick animals or from hunting small game. Hunting large animals like deer was forbidden on pain of harsh punishment, for forests belonged to nobles. A peasant caught poaching could lose a hand or their life. Fish could be eaten if one lived near rivers or coastlines, but even fish were heavily regulated. Salt was precious, and fresh fish spoiled quickly, making preservation difficult. When fasting days arrived, which was over 150 days a year, meat was forbidden by the church, and the diet narrowed even further. Milk, butter, and cheese were seasonal luxuries. Cows produced little milk in winter when fodder was scarce. Most dairy went to children and the sick. Adults often survived on weak beer or ale, safer than water that was frequently contaminated. Drinking water straight from a river or well could be dangerous, especially near settlements where waste was discarded into the same supply. So ale became the everyday drink, brewed lightly and consumed throughout the day, including by children. If you imagine yourself holding a wooden bowl of thick barley pottage, smelling faintly sour, and a hardened crust of rye bread, you are close to understanding a typical meal. There were no utensils beyond spoons carved from wood or bone. Knives were personal and rarely sharp. Meals were eaten slowly, thoughtfully, because every bite mattered. Waste was unthinkable. And even with all this effort, hours of labor, constant planning, rigid rationing, hunger persisted. Bad weather, poor harvests, disease, or tax demands could push a family to starvation. A harsh winter or crop failure could mean death for thousands, and famine disproportionately affected peasants, who were expected to continue paying obligations no matter how empty their homes became. Despite such hardship, daily life went on. People married. They celebrated small holidays. They sang songs around simple fires. The rhythm of labor, shared suffering, and small moments of comfort bound communities together. There is a quiet strength in imagining the resilience of people who survived not through glory or heroism, but through routine and endurance. And so, if you were a medieval peasant, when you sat down to your meal, perhaps after 14 hours in the fields, you might close your eyes for a moment and simply breathe, grateful for even a coarse loaf of barley bread and a bowl of simmering pottage. You would know that every meal was uncertain, every harvest a test, and every day a delicate balance between survival and hunger. But what happened when the harvest failed? When rain came too long or not at all? When fields turned yellow and grain stores grew empty, and the communal oven went cold? What did ordinary people do when there was simply not enough bread? When the harvest failed in medieval Europe, the consequences were swift, brutal, and unmistakable. The grain fields that ordinarily rippled with shades of gold or pale green would stand thin and brittle, stalks bending under dry winds or rotting from unrelenting rain. Whole months of labor could be undone in a matter of days. A season of bad weather was not an inconvenience. It was a catastrophe. For the medieval peasant, survival was a delicate equilibrium, and when that balance faltered, hunger evolved from a familiar ache into a silent terror that spread across villages like a shadow. During a good year, most peasants barely produced enough grain to sustain themselves after taxes, tithes to the church, and obligations to their lords. There was little room for surplus. A single crop failure could mean reduced rations. 2 consecutive failures could mean famine. And famine was not merely the absence of food, but the collapse of a community's ability to live with even the smallest sense of security. To understand this fear, imagine the annual agricultural cycle. The year was divided not by months or holidays, but by work. Winter was a time of rationing and maintenance. Spring brought plowing and planting. Summer meant constant labor in the fields. Autumn was the harvest, the moment on which everything depended. Each grain stored, each sack dried and sealed, was a promise of survival. Villagers gathered in barns, inside granaries, filling them with husked barley, rye, or oats. These stores would be carefully guarded, counted, and distributed through the year. When the harvest was good, there was relief. When the harvest was poor, men and women felt a cold dread settle in their bodies. The first sign of trouble was thinning meals. A family would stretch bread by mixing in more beans, peas, or ground acorns. Pieces would be cut smaller. Pottage, the ever-present stew, would be diluted until it resembled thick water. Salt was hoarded. Cheese disappeared entirely. The elderly often volunteered to eat less, believing it was their role to protect the young. And silently, behind closed shutters, neighbors might hide small stores from each other, afraid of thieves or desperate pleas they could not satisfy. By late winter or early spring, the worst time of the year arrived. The hungry gap, that bleak stretch when old supplies ran out and new crops had not yet grown. This was the season when famine tightened its grip. Bread was baked from whatever could be ground fine enough to resemble flour, tree bark, moss, ground nettles, ferns, and even straw. Such bread was dark, fibrous, bitter, and barely nutritious, but it gave the illusion of eating. Chroniclers of the time wrote grim descriptions: bread that broke teeth, loaves that smelled of rot, mixtures that caused deadly sickness. Yet people ate them because there was nothing else to eat. When hunger grew unbearable, peasants turned to the forests and riverbanks. Children were sent to gather anything edible: wild herbs, chestnuts, hazelnuts, snail shells, edible roots, sorrel, sorghum, berries, mushrooms, though mushrooms were dangerous, for one mistake could mean slow poisoning. Fishing increased, though rivers were often controlled by lords who punished illegal nets with frightening severity. Even bird eggs became valuable, collected from treetops and cliff edges. Some families abandoned their homes entirely, walking miles in search of monasteries where alms might be given. Monasteries were among the few places where the poor could expect charity food, bread distributions at gates, weak beer, or pottage made for the needy. But monks could not save everyone, and at times they turned people away, overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Bands of starving peasants wandered the roads, begging for scraps from passing carts or stopping at village boundaries where guards blocked entry to prevent theft or disease. And still, there were darker chapters. When hunger was extreme, society began to fray at its edges. Records from medieval chroniclers, like those during the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, describe scenes nearly unimaginable: parents abandoning children, people digging up buried grain, theft growing rampant, and in the direst accounts, rumors of cannibalism. These accounts are difficult to verify, but their presence in multiple sources reflects the desperation people feared most deeply. Sometimes famine was not merely bad luck, but worsened by human decisions. Lords still collected taxes even when peasants starved. The church continued demanding tithes. Merchants hoarded grain to increase prices. Markets became battlegrounds between hunger and profit. Grain riots erupted in towns where poor laborers broke into warehouses or intercepted shipments. The wealthy barricaded their doors, and soldiers guarded granaries. Villages survived by making hard choices. They rationed wheat for planting and consumed cheaper grains themselves. They threshed fields a second time, collecting stray kernels from the ground. They boiled bones to extract every trace of fat. They slaughtered draft animals, oxen and horses, destroying the ability to work fields once conditions improved. Tools were sold, land abandoned, and marriages postponed. Starvation changed everything. Even so, there were those who held communities together. Wise women who knew which herbs could heal and which could kill. Priests who opened church stores in secret. Skilled millers who stretched grain in ways others could not. There were moments of profound solidarity. Neighbors sharing food despite having little. families adopting orphan children, men hunting at night under fear of punishment. Suffering built unlikely alliances. In these bleakest times, the only true hope was the next harvest. Every spring, seeds were planted with trembling anxiety. The sky became a source of obsession. Too much rain, too little rain, unseasonable frost, swarming insects, mildew, blight, all became threats. The villagers watched the sky for omens. They prayed for sun and feared thunder. The horizon itself seemed to dictate their fate. Imagine standing in a muddy field, knees deep in wet soil, looking across rows of fragile shoots. You would feel the weight of every life depending on those thin green threads. The survival of your family, your children, your neighbors. Everything rested on forces you could neither predict nor control. You might whisper a prayer not because you were holy, but because there was nothing else to do. When a harvest finally succeeded after famine years, the relief was overwhelming. People collapsed in fields, weeping. Bells rang across villages. Bread tasted sweeter than any feast. But famine left scars. Teeth cracked from eating bark bread. Children stunted from malnutrition grew into adults with weak bones. Families never recovered lost land. Hunger became a memory that shaped every decision thereafter. How much to store, how much to plant, how much to trust. And so medieval life was not defined by battles or kings, but by the precarious victory over starvation. It was not triumph in war, but endurance in ordinary hardship that kept people alive. Survival was not heroic. It was monotonous, repetitive, and constant. As you imagine yourself finishing a thin slice of rye bread softened in watery pottage, you might look toward the grain sack in the corner of the cottage. You would count what remains and realize there are only a few days left. Outside, clouds gather. The sky darkens. Rain begins to fall, hard and cold, pounding the earth. And you would feel it again, that quiet, creeping fear. What happens when the rain does not stop and fields begin to drown instead of grow? When the rains finally stopped, or when the long dry winds eased, or when the last frost loosened its grip from the soil, the first fragile signs of recovery appeared so quietly that they were easy to overlook. A faint green haze across the fields, the distant sound of a millstone turning again, smoke rising from the communal oven after months of stillness. These were not dramatic triumphs or heroic victories. No fanfare, no proclamations, but they were the beginnings of survival. For medieval peasants, resilience was not a sudden transformation. It was a slow rebuilding, measured one seed, one loaf, one day at a time. After famine years, the world did not simply return to normal. The landscape itself bore scars. Fields that had been abandoned were choked with weeds. Tools were broken or sold. Oxen were gone, slaughtered for meat when desperation peaked. People were fewer, villages thinned by hunger, disease, and displacement. Families that once worked side by side found themselves missing brothers, sisters, parents, children. And yet, when the next season began, peasants stepped back into the cycle of work with a determination that appears quiet but unwavering. There was something profoundly ordinary and profoundly powerful in the way communities resumed their labor. If you were one of them, you would rise at dawn and take a hoe to the field. even if your hands trembled with weakness left from hunger. You would plant seeds carefully, knowing that each represented not only food but hope. You would watch the sky again, not with dread, but with cautious patience. To rebuild after famine required cooperation, and medieval village life relied on shared labor more than any romantic image of rugged individualism. You might help mend the roof of a neighbor's barn so they could store hay again. Children might be sent to collect stones for repairing field walls. Women gathered herbs and shared knowledge of which plants restored strength or eased fever. Men took turns repairing the heavy plow frame, piecing it together with sparse materials. One of the most important communal tasks was the rebuilding of livestock. Without oxen, fields could not be plowed deeply enough for grain to grow well. Villagers pooled whatever resources they had: coins saved, cloth traded, labor promised, in hopes of purchasing at least one pair. Even if the animals were thin, even if they came from far away and staggered with exhaustion when they arrived, they represented the ability to begin again. Land itself might be redistributed. Fields left untended during famine were claimed by wealthier landowners, driving peasants deeper into dependency. In other places, however, the opposite occurred. With fewer laborers and more land available, peasants negotiated better rights, lower rents, or the ability to work their own plots more freely. After the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, and later after the devastation of the Black Death, labor became a valuable commodity. For the first time in generations, peasants could bargain. Some even walked away from their villages, following rumors of better wages in towns. There was a new rhythm to life, the rhythm of rebuilding. The communal oven fired again, sending the warm, heavy smell of baking bread through narrow village lanes. Pottage simmered with fresh herbs instead of scraps of dried weeds. Children's laughter returned to fields as they gathered wildflowers or chased each other along hedgerows. Music returned to taverns, played on pipes and rebecks worn smooth from years of handling. The simple sound of a bell calling workers to the harvest field became a reminder not of labor alone, but of survival. But recovery was not just physical. It reshaped the way people thought. For many peasants, famine changed their understanding of fairness and control. They saw clearly how distant lords lived unaffected behind stone walls while ordinary families starved. They remembered grain hoarded while children begged. They witnessed the failure of systems meant to protect them. And slowly, a new sense of agency grew. It is surprising to realize how profoundly these quiet struggles influenced history. The pressure created by repeated famines and shortages contributed to revolts across Europe. The English peasants' revolt of 1381, the Jacquerie in France, and uprisings in Flanders and Germany. Ordinary people who had endured hunger began to speak of rights, of just wages, fair laws, and freedom from serfdom. These demands were not born from ideology, but from experience. The memory of starvation made people unwilling to return to silence. Yet even without rebellion, resilience took many small forms. A widow who lost her family might take in orphaned children. A young man might share his bread with neighbors who had nothing left. Priests, who once preached obedience, began keeping secret charity stores. Millers reduced their fees. Midwives exchanged skills for grain rather than coin. These moments were rarely recorded, yet they shaped the lives of thousands. Daily routines resumed. Bread, though still coarse and dark, tasted richer than before because it was no longer born of desperation. Pottage filled with fresh vegetables felt like a feast. Ale brewed from new barley had a sweetness that seemed miraculous. The simple act of eating until full, something once taken for granted, became a quiet celebration. Imagine sitting again at the wooden table inside a small cottage. Outside the window, fields stretch wide under a pale morning sun. Beside your bread, there is cheese, not much, but enough. There is a bowl of pottage with carrots and leeks floating inside. The steam rises gently, and when you breathe it in, you feel your body relax. For the first time in years, the ache inside you begins to fade. You chew slowly, grateful for every bite. Not triumphant, not victorious, simply alive. And as you eat, you hear laughter outside, children running to chase birds out of the grain field. Somewhere nearby, the sound of the mill will turning signals that grain is being ground again. Life is fragile, yet it persists. In these moments, something extraordinary becomes clear. History is not shaped only by kings and battles. It is shaped by the persistence of ordinary people, people who rebuild after everything has fallen apart. Their quiet strength lays foundations stronger than any castle stone. The medieval peasant did not dream of glory. They dreamed of harvests, of warmth, of bread soft enough not to break teeth. And when they achieved these small victories, they built the world we inherited. But even in times of recovery, the future could never be entirely trusted. One question remained, haunting, unspoken, and always present. When the next hardship arrives, and it always does, will the lessons learned be enough to survive it again? And what did these cycles of famine and survival ultimately teach medieval society about resilience, community, and the fragile balance of life? When we look back at the Middle Ages, it is tempting to picture a world defined by crowns and war. Kings clashing on muddy battlefields, armies marching with banners snapping against gray skies, castles rising in stone strength above quiet countryside. But if we measure history not by the noise of the powerful, but by the steady heartbeat of ordinary lives, we find a different story entirely. The real shape of the medieval world was carved not by swords, but by hunger, not by victories in war, but by the struggle for bread. The daily battle for food was the most consistent and universal experience of medieval Europeans. It shaped every aspect of society: labor, law, religion, economy, and community. And its legacy echoing through history is far more significant than many realize. The medieval peasant's life revolved around the agricultural calendar. Every task, every celebration, every fear was tethered to the rhythm of the fields. Spring meant planting, hard, back-breaking work driven by optimism and anxiety. Summer demanded vigilance. Days spent weeding, repairing fences, driving off animals, protecting crops from insects. Autumn meant harvest, frantic, exhausting labor to gather every grain before frost or storms arrived. Winter was not rest, but waiting, measuring supplies, rationing carefully, praying for spring. This cycle did not simply organize work, it organized belief. The church structured holy days around agricultural needs, blending religion with necessity. Saints were invoked to bless crops, protect animals, and bring rain or sun as required. Festivals like Lammas and Pentecost celebrated the first bread from new grain or the promise of future harvests. Even the concept of sin became linked to food, with gluttony and waste condemned harshly. To waste bread was viewed as an affront to both God and community. Meals themselves were rituals of memory and gratitude. A family might cross themselves before cutting a loaf, turning the act of eating into a quiet acknowledgement of survival. Bread was not merely food, it was sacred. The word Lord itself traces to Old English meaning giver of bread. To feed others was a responsibility that defined power. To fail in that duty was a moral failure judged by both heaven and earth. Yet hunger did more than shape spirituality, it shaped society. Because famine returned regularly, medieval communities learned the importance of preparation and cooperation. Villagers developed intricate systems of communal support, such as shared fields, collective grazing land, and rotational farming that protected soil fertility. The open field system, where land was divided into long, narrow strips farmed collectively, was a response to scarcity. No land was wasted. Every hand mattered. Harvests were not individual achievements, but community victories. Grain storage, too, became a science born of necessity. Peasants learned to dry wheat on racks, smoke oats to protect them from mold, and seal granaries with thick clay. Pit storage and barrel storage were designed to keep vermin away. Monasteries developed advanced techniques for milling and brewing, turning grain into more durable forms. Even the medieval preference for ale over water was a survival adaptation. The brewing process killed bacteria water could not. Famine also drove innovation. When grain failed, people experimented with alternative foods, legumes, root vegetables, hardy plants like turnips and cabbages that could survive harsh weather. Over centuries, these foods became staples that diversified diets and reduced vulnerability. The spread of the three-field rotation system, one field planted in autumn, one in spring, one left fallow, dramatically improved food production and changed the structure of European agriculture. But perhaps the most far-reaching legacy of hunger was the challenge it posed to entrenched social hierarchies. In times of famine, peasants could see clearly that suffering was not shared equally. The wealthy continued to feast while the poor starved. Lords hoarded grain, and the church maintained tithes even as bodies fell in the streets. This disparity fueled anger that simmered into rebellion. The memory of famine helped ignite some of the most significant social uprisings of the later Middle Ages. The English peasants' revolt of 1381 was driven not by abstract philosophy, but by lived experience, by people who had endured hunger, survived plague, and refused to return to obedience without question. They marched demanding fair wages, reduced taxes, and the end of serfdom. They were brutally suppressed, but the ideas they voiced did not disappear. Over the following centuries, serfdom weakened and eventually collapsed across much of Western Europe. The balance of power shifted slowly, but decisively, toward ordinary people. Even food itself became political. The price of bread determined the stability of cities. When bread prices rose, riots followed. Markets adjusted to protect supply. Governments enforced regulations on grain hoarding and milling. These early efforts to control food distribution laid foundations for modern economic policy and public welfare systems. It is striking to consider that the world we know today, our laws, economies, and ideas of fairness, is rooted in the struggles of medieval peasants who fought not for glory but for sustenance. Their endurance shaped the future far more profoundly than the victories of kings whose names fill textbooks. So what can we learn from their story? First, that survival is not dramatic. It is patient. It is repetitive. It requires cooperation more than confrontation. The medieval peasants who rebuilt their lives after famine did so not with heroism, but with quiet, persistent labor. They planted again. They saved what little they had. They helped one another. Their strength lay not in defiance, but in endurance. Second, that scarcity teaches values abundance cannot. When food was precious, people learned gratitude. They cherished the ordinary. Bread became a symbol of community and hope. Meals were moments of reflection, not distraction. Third, that history belongs not only to the powerful. The unnamed laborers, millers, farmers, bakers, and herdsmen, the people whose hands shaped the land, built the foundations on which later generations relied. Their struggles remind us that progress is cumulative and fragile. Finally, hunger is a teacher that spans centuries. Even today, food insecurity shapes political decisions, drives migration, influences conflict, and tests the bonds of society. The lessons of medieval famine remain painfully relevant. Climate change, war, and economic instability remind us how easily abundance can slip away and how much depends on preparation and cooperation. So if you sit quietly now, imagining a wooden bowl of warm pottage in your hands, think of the countless lives that hinged on such a meal. Think of the generations who survived on coarse bread and weak ale, who rebuilt after each disaster, who whispered gratitude for every harvest. Their perseverance is the true legacy of medieval history. It is not a story of kings or heroes. It is a story of ordinary people who refuse to give up. And perhaps the most important unresolved question is the one they ask themselves in every season, every year, every lifetime. How do we prepare for the hardships we do not yet see coming? What lessons from the past will guide us when the future becomes uncertain again? If you lived in ancient Rome, not as a senator, nor a soldier, nor a scholar, but as an ordinary laborer, your life would not unfold in marble halls or shaded gardens decorated with fountains. It would unfold beneath the sun, under dust-heavy skies that smelled of limestone and sweat, on scaffolding made from rough-cut wood, among the echoing clang of iron tools against unyielding stone. You would be one of the workers who built the aqueducts, those long, silent rivers of engineered stone that carried clean water across valleys, plains, and mountains into the heart of the Roman world. You might never see the inside of a villa with mosaic floors, or hear poetry performed in a forum. You might never bathe in the grand public thermae, where polished marble embraced steaming pools. Instead, you would spend your days shaping stone blocks, digging trenches, hauling tools, and advancing slowly along the vast path of an aqueduct that could stretch for tens or even hundreds of kilometers. Your work would be invisible to most of society, but without it, Rome would not have been Rome. Water was life, and you were one of its makers, the world of the aqueduct builder. To understand your daily life, you must begin at dawn. Before sunrise, the city is quiet, but the work yard is already awake. You walk from your small rented room, a cramped space above a shop or shared with other laborers, and join the other men in the dusty open field where tools are stored. You carry little with you. A simple tunic belted with rope, worn sandals, a piece of coarse bread to eat during the day, perhaps a clay cup for water or cheap wine. There is no time for leisure or talk. Foremen shout orders. Teams divide. Today you might be quarrying stone. Tomorrow hauling mortar. Next week digging channels with wooden shovels and soil as hard as fired clay. Roman engineering projects were enormous and required strict organization. Hundreds, sometimes thousands, of hands moved the aqueduct inch by inch across the landscape. At the head of the project were skilled architects and surveyors. They were educated in geometry and mathematics, carrying tools such as the corebates, a long wooden leveling instrument balanced with water to measure gradients, and the groma, a simple survey tool that allowed straight lines to be mapped across uneven terrain. Without these men, water would not flow properly, for an aqueduct required an almost impossibly precise slope. Just a few centimeters fall for every kilometer. Too steep, and the water would rush and erode. Too shallow, and it would stop entirely. But surveyors alone could not carve channels through mountains or raise arches across valleys. That was the work of you and your fellow laborers, structories, masons, fossers, diggers, tignarii, carpenters, and fabri, ironworkers. You were contracted by the state or by wealthy officials seeking political favor. Some of your companions were free citizens. Others were enslaved, captured from distant provinces. Gauls, Iberians, Greeks, Syrians, Africans. You might not speak the same language, but you understood the language of labor. The gestures, the rhythm, the collective grunt as heavy blocks were lifted by ropes through pulleys. The day begins with the rough work of preparing materials. Stone is cut into massive blocks using iron chisels and hammers. Each strike sending shards flying, stinging exposed skin. The dust clings to your hair, to your tunic, to the inside of your throat. Near the construction line, massive wooden scaffolds rise like skeletal ribs above the ground. Men climb them with rope slings across their shoulders, carrying blocks that weigh more than a man. Others mix pozzolana, volcanic ash from the region near Naples, with lime and crushed stone to create Roman concrete, the marvel that allowed structures to stand for centuries. The work never truly stops. There are no weekends. There are feast days, yes, but work often continues even then. You labor under the heat of scorching summer months, when the sun burns the skin and sweat falls into your eyes, and through the wet chill of winter, when cold seeps into your bones and hands numb around tools. Injuries are common. Bones break, tools slip, scaffolds collapse. There are no physicians on site, no protection, no compensation. A man injured might return home never to work again, his family facing hunger. But despite the danger, workers come. They come because the pay, though small, is more reliable than many jobs. They come because Rome demands water and water demands builders. The purpose behind the labor. It is difficult to grasp how essential aqueducts were to Roman life. Before their construction, people relied on wells, rainwater, or polluted rivers. But with aqueducts, water flowed continuously from distant springs and mountains, supplying cities that would have otherwise collapsed under their own size. When Rome reached its peak population, over 1 million people, it consumed hundreds of millions of liters of water every day. Aqueducts carried water not only for drinking, but for public baths, fountains, toilets, and cleaning streets. They fed workshops, mills, and irrigation systems. Water was a resource of civilization, and Rome treated it as the mark of superiority. Yet for you, the aqueduct was not a symbol of greatness. It was work. It was the weight of stone on your back and the ache in your hands at the end of the day. You may not feel pride, only exhaustion. But as the months pass, you watch the arches rise taller, the long channel stretching across hills, the stone trough forming an unbroken line. You begin to understand that you are building something larger than yourself, something that will outlast your own life. If you walk the length of the construction in the evening, after the tools have been put away, you will see an almost endless procession of stone blocks leading into the distance. Beyond the horizon lies the spring where the water begins its journey. You might imagine the path the water will one day take, flowing silently through the covered channel, passing beneath dark tunnels and open bridges, descending gently into the city where it will burst into sunlight again through fountains carved with marble figures. The people who one day drink that water will not know your name. They will not know the names of the hundreds who shaped and transported each stone, but they will feel your work every time water flows clean and cold into a public basin. Life outside the work site. When the sun begins to fall and the day's labor ends, your body is sore, your hands raw, your stomach hollow. You walk with others back toward the city or temporary camp. The streets are still alive with noise, vendors calling out, children playing, carts creaking under the weight of goods. The smell of cooking fills the air, lentils simmering, bread baking, garlic frying in oil. Perhaps you stop at a tavern, spending a small portion of your wage for a cup of sour wine or a bowl of barley porridge. You sit on a wooden bench, stretching your legs, feeling the tiredness settle deep in your bones. Men speak quietly of home, of wages earned, of rumors about promotions or changes in leadership. Some dream of saving enough to open a shop or buy a small piece of land. Others know they will die working, their stories unrecorded. You listen, but mostly you are quiet, conserving energy for the next dawn. There is no luxury in your life, but there are small moments of comfort. A loaf of fresh bread shared with a friend, the cool air at dusk, the satisfaction of seeing your work grow, a letter from family carried by travelers from far provinces, a festival day when work pauses and the city celebrates with music and fire. You return to sleep, curling on a straw-filled mattress. Your muscles pulse with fatigue. Outside, the city hums. And before sleep claims you, one thought returns again and again. Tomorrow, there will be more stone to cut, more scaffolding to climb, more weight to bear, and the aqueduct must continue. Yet one question remains unspoken among the workers, whispered only when the fire burns low and no overseers stand nearby. What happens when the structure reaches the mountains, when tunnels must be carved through solid rock and darkness replaces sky? What dangers wait unseen beneath the earth? When the aqueduct finally reached the foothills of the mountains, everything changed. The open air, the long lines of arches, and the predictable rhythm of lifting and setting stone gave way to something far more grueling and perilous. The surveyors, with their measuring tools and careful calculations, led the workers into the rocky slopes where the ground rose sharply, and the path of the aqueduct could no longer follow the surface. Here, the engineers demanded a new kind of labor, tunneling through the mountain itself. A murmur spread among the workers when the orders were given. Cutting stone in the open was exhausting, but tunneling meant something else entirely. Days spent underground, beneath tons of unyielding rock, where a single mistake could suffocate, crush, or bury men alive. The architects described the plan with confidence, pointing to maps and elevation drawings, their words confident and smooth. But their ink drawings did not capture the fear that settled in the stomach. For those who would swing hammers and chisels in the dark, this new stage demanded more than skill. It demanded trust that the mountain would hold. You are among the workers chosen to begin the tunnel, one of many teams spaced along the projected line. Roman engineers did not dig from one end to the other. Instead, they performed careful surveys and then ordered shafts dug vertically into the mountain from above. From the bottom of each shaft, horizontal tunnels extended toward one another, meeting deep beneath the surface. It was a brilliant method, one that allowed construction to proceed simultaneously in many places, but it depended on extraordinary precision. If the surveyors miscalculated, the tunnels would never align. Many laborers whispered prayers that the men with measuring rods and weighted lines were more reliable than the gods. The descent. The first time you entered the vertical shaft, your body tensed with instinctive fear. A crude wooden ladder climbed downward into darkness. The air was cool and damp, smelling of earth and minerals. At the bottom, torchlight flickered against rough stone walls. The tunnel was barely wide enough for two men to pass each other. Your shoulders brushed the rock as you moved deeper, and the sound of chisels striking echoed like distant thunder, repeating endlessly. Work in the tunnels began with fire and water. Fires were built directly against the rock face, heating it until cracks formed. Then cold water was thrown onto the hot stone, the sudden shock fracturing it so chisels could bite more effectively. The explosions of steam were violent and unpredictable. When they struck too fast or too early, sharp fragments flew through the air, and men shielded their faces with leather scraps or arms. Slaves, those with no rights, no wages, and no choice, were often assigned to stand closest. Injuries were accepted as part of the cost. After the rock cracked, the masons, lapicity, moved forward with iron picks and double-headed hammers. The blows rang like metal bells in the narrow darkness, vibrating through your skull. Dust filled the air, thick and gritty. Torches smoked heavily, consuming what little oxygen the tunnel held. After an hour of labor, your lungs burned, breath shallow and ragged. Workers rotated frequently, retreating to the shaft opening to gulp fresh air before returning. There were no breaks long enough for rest, only pauses long enough not to collapse. Progress measured in meters or centimeters, sometimes only millimeters. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Each sunrise and sunset passed without meaning, unseen from underground. You carried time in the tightening exhaustion of your muscles, and the wear of iron tools growing dull. The ever-present danger. The danger beneath the mountain was constant and merciless. A crack of stone overhead could mean death in an instant. When rocks shifted, men froze, listening silently as dust drifted through flickering torchlight. More than once, sections of tunnel collapsed. A shout from the forward line would echo, followed by frantic scrambling as workers fled back through narrow spaces. Sometimes they made it out. Sometimes they did not. Bodies removed from the tunnels were wrapped in rough cloth and carried away with little ceremony. A few words might be spoken, names murmured, but work resumed within hours, tools striking rock as though nothing had changed. There was no time for mourning. The aqueduct had to move forward, and those who remained could not afford to question its cost. Even when stone did not fall, other dangers lurked. Bad air, what Romans called mephitic vapors, collected in pockets underground. Workers grew faint, trembling, their vision shrinking to points of light. Some collapsed entirely, lungs refusing to draw breath. Only by dragging them back to the shaft and forcing fresh air into their lungs could they be revived. Others never woke again. Engineers attempted to improve ventilation by carving small openings upward or forcing air circulation with cloth fans. But these solutions helped only slightly. Most men learned to read the signs themselves. Dizziness, metallic taste, sudden headaches. Those who ignored the warnings did not survive long. Solidarity in darkness. Despite the danger, the tunnels forged unusual bonds among workers. Men who labored shoulder to shoulder beneath the earth relied on each other in ways that transcended language or background. Free citizens worked beside enslaved laborers and freedmen, provincial captives beside Roman-born craftsmen. In the darkness, status mattered less than trust. There were moments of silence between strikes when the tunnels vibrated softly, as if the mountain breathed. In these pauses, men spoke quietly. They shared fears, whispered jokes to lighten the weight, told stories of distant homes or families lost to war or plague. Some carried small charms, stones carved with symbols, bits of metal shaped like animals, scraps of cloth from loved ones. They believed these fragments held protection, luck, or memory. You carried a thin strip of leather from your father's belt, the only thing you had left from him. Meals underground were simple: coarse bread, olives when available, dried figs or dates, sometimes cheese if wages had recently been paid. Water was precious and carried in clay flasks. Workers would pass a single loaf carefully down the line, each breaking a piece with the reverence of ceremony. Food tasted of dust and fatigue, but it sustained life, barely. At night, when you emerged into open air, the stars felt unreal, distant, like a dream remembered faintly. The world above seemed too large, too empty after the close press of stone. You lay on your straw pallet, ears still ringing from the constant hammering, and wondered how long the mountain would demand your strength. The endless distance. Weeks passed, and the tunnel deepened. When the workers in the opposite direction were close enough, you began to hear their echoes through the rock. Faint, rhythmic, like a heartbeat. The engineers smiled with satisfaction, confident their measurements were correct. But rumors spread that the last tunnel constructed in another province had missed alignment by several meters, requiring months of correction. Workers muttered darkly about wasted labor and the impatience of wealthy patrons demanding faster progress. Tension grew as the teams approached each other. Every swing of the hammer felt heavier with anticipation. If the surveys were wrong, all the sweat and risk would be meaningless. But if they were right, a sudden breakthrough would bring light tearing through the darkness like a sunrise after endless night. One morning, the tone of the rock changed beneath the chisel. A dull thud replaced sharp ringing. Workers froze, breath held. A second strike, then a third. On the fourth, the stone face shuddered and broke outward, and a rush of air burst through the tunnel. Dust and fragments flew in all directions. The torchlight flickered wildly. Through the hole, another torch burned. Another face appeared, grinning, covered in grime, eyes shining with triumph. The tunnels had met. Shouts filled the underground passage, echoing like rolling thunder. Men embraced, clapped shoulders, and laughed. A deep, exhausted laughter that came from months of restrained fear. Even the overseers smiled. For a moment, the mountain felt conquered. But as the celebration faded and the workers climbed back into open air, one thought hung quietly between every heartbeat. The aqueduct still had miles to go, more mountains to cross, more valleys to span, more stone to cut, and the greatest challenge, the long descent to the city, was still ahead. What would happen when water finally flowed for the first time? What if all this effort failed to hold? What if the aqueduct cracked or collapsed under its own weight? What price would be demanded next in the name of progress?